Hello, my name is Sarah Kelly. I'm the Windgate Curator of Contemporary Craft and Design at the Arizona State University Art Museum and Ceramics Research Center, which you'll hear us referring to here as a CRC. I'm here sharing virtual space with Peter Held today. It's March 5th, 2021. Peter, will you just say a quick hello, maybe your name for the recording, and also what was your position at the CRC and for how long?
So my name is Peter Held, and I was the first curator of ceramics at the Ceramic Research Center. Prior to that, Heather Lineberry was overseeing the collection. I came in the spring of 2003 and retired sometime in 2014. So I was there about 12 years.
Great. So Peter, before we get started, I actually just want to share a bit of gratitude with you. So for the context for our listeners, we met a few years ago at NCECA, which is the big national conference for ceramics education. I was a graduate student at Warren Wilson's Critical Craft Studies program at that time, and we were introduced because of some of my interests. And while our conversation was certainly fruitful that day, I never could have known really the long-term impact our conversation would have on me. At that point, I was not necessarily thinking of a career in museum curation, but that day you introduced me to the CRC. Months later, I applied for my first museum job in Asheville, North Carolina, and I just so happened to also be working on a small project at that time about Karen Carnes, which of course I found out that the CRC had some really amazing and unique archival resources for that project. I then began to use the CRC as a reliable source in my research, not just for school, but also curating in that first museum job. Then, funny enough, my first public program once I got to ASU was giving a talk on Karen Carnes. Of course, Peter, you were the first person I knew I needed to call for that talk. So before we learn more about you, I just want to say a big personal thank you for that initial connection, and also share my experience as an example of how you continue to be someone in the field with really a great impact, and also, as the CRC as a whole as well. So thank you so much for that, and thanks for allowing me, that moment to share.
It was a great start to our relationship.
Yeah, I would say so. And a really special one too. So can you tell me a little bit about your personal background before you came to the CRC, and how you became involved with that project?
Well, starting out, I grew up in Long Island, New York, and was fortunate to have parents that were supportive of the arts. I ended up going to SUNY Brockport undergraduate school in upstate New York for an art degree. I was fortunate that at the time, Bill Stewart was teaching ceramics. He was one of the few East Coast artists that were sort of involved with the funk movement. And at the same, though, Wendell Castle, a pioneering furniture maker, was teaching there, and Albert Paley, a well-known metalsmith, was there. So they were just phenomenal role models. And this is 1973. So the craft field was a lot smaller then. And to have those role models, to interact with them, was a really phenomenal experience. And then, I was thinking about graduate school and decided instead to apply for a residency at the Archie Bray Foundation in Helena, Montana, and was accepted there. So I worked at the Bray in 1974, 1975, and the Bray at the time was a lot smaller place as well. They only accepted about 5 or 6 artists to be there, and that was really a pivotal experience in my life. It was the first time I was sort of independent in a studio, yet had colleagues to get back from and start building a community. So I'm still associated, from afar with the Archie Bray Foundation after all these years. They asked me to organize a book on for the Bray's 50th anniversary in 2001. So, I lived in Helena when I was at the Bray, and I ended up staying there and starting a family. And I was doing all sorts of things. I worked for the Forest Service for a while. I was hotshot firefighter for the Forest Service.
Oh,
I
I
ended
didn't
up,
know that.
yeah, I did that for 2 years. And then I happened to meet an old stonemason that was in town, one of the only few. And for some reason, the idea of working with stone appealed to me. So I ended up working with him for about a year. And at that time, he was in his late 70s and just about to retire. So he retired, but I still had an interest. So foolish me, I started my own business and ended up being a masonry contractor for 10 years in Helena, which was great. Building stone walls. I was mostly building dry stack walls. Provided a creative outlet for me that was sort of equal to being in a ceramic studio. And one of the reasons why I left ceramics was I was in the studio 6 or 7 days a week, 10 or 14 hours a day. A similar story. A lot of people share. But for me, it ended up being a little bit too limiting. I had other interests that I wanted to explore. So when I was approaching 40 years old, right before that, I volunteered at the Montana Historical Society Museum. That was my first sort of entree into the museum world and the back door. And I really just loved being around objects every day and seeing the potential of learning from those objects. So I started looking at various museum studies programs around the country and ended up getting my master's at Oregon State University, which at the time had an interdisciplinary museum studies program. So, I was 40 years old. I had 2 kids already. My wife was pregnant, and we were off to a roaring start. Graduated from the program. So my major was museum studies, and then I had a minor in business administration and art history. And then after graduating, I got a job in Salem, Oregon, as a gallery director for Community Arts Center. I was there for 3 years. Ended up going back to Helena to be the director of the Holter Museum of Art, which was a relatively new museum at the time, and was director there for 10 years. So when I first arrived there, their annual budget was about $50,000. There was myself as director curator, an administrative assistant, a janitor, and a receptionist, and that's about it. So I was there for 10 years, and in that time, I think the staff was probably 10 or 12 people. We did a $2 million capital campaign added to the building. But during that 10 years, I was curating 10 or 12 shows a year. We had 3 galleries that rotated often. And, while I'm known as the ceramic guy, I've curated a lot of contemporary art shows in all sorts of media. So towards the end of working the Holter, I happened to see an ad advertising the ceramic position at ASU. And on a lark, I applied for it. And lo and behold, I got hired.
Great. So how did the CRC start? Can you tell us a little bit of the story of its sort of early
Sure.
days?
So Rudy Turk, who was the founding director of the ASU Art Museum, arrived at ASU in 1967. And prior to that, he had several positions. At one point, he was a gallery director at the University of Montana. This is back in the 50s, late 50s. And Rudy Audio was teaching ceramics there at the time, and they became good friends. And that sparked Rudy Turk's interest in the studio ceramics. After that, he went to the Bay Area and was director of the Richmond Arts Center. This is in the early 60s. And again, he was exposed to a lot of ceramic activity, interacting with Robert Arneson at E. Davis, Manuel Neary, other people. So, his love for ceramics was planted early. So he arrived at ASU. He had a limited budget. And at the time, the museum was located at Matthews Center, which was the old library on campus before they built the new Hayden Library. And Rudy was very fluid in his ideas of what art, craft, design, folk art was, and didn't create any boundaries. He was really fluid in interchanging objects, no matter where they first came or what they were previously labeled. The other thing too was Rudy was always committed to open storage, and at the time, I think he was probably one of the first museum directors committed to that concept. Although more and more museums are doing it now, but in the 1960s, it was quite rare. So one of the funniest stories Rudy told me early on in his career at ASU, he wanted to buy a Volcus vessel, and the cost was $500. He ended up buying it. It was one of Volcus's Black Series. And once the dean found out he spent $500, the dean read him the Riot Act. And right now that pot is probably worth $100,000. So anyway, Rudy realized that, with a limited budget, he wasn't able to buy major paintings or sculptures within the fine art mainstream. So he started collecting more and more ceramics. And during that time, Joanne Rapp in Scottsdale had the Hand in the Spirit Gallery, which at the time was one of the premier craft galleries, showing Dale Terhooly's glass, David Shaner's ceramics, Claude Conover, fiber artists. And Rudy and Joanne formed a strong relationship and friendship over the years. And then over the course of time, several people started relocating to the Phoenix area. Stefan Jansen and Michael Johns, well-known collectors, moved to the area. Jay and Joyce Cooper had always lived in Phoenix, but they were major ceramic collectors, mostly of California funk ceramics. Sarah and David Lieberman, Suzanne Peterson, well-known scholar, writer, author. So it was sort of this constellation of people that were floating around the valley and eventually met and came together and were supportive of Rudy's and the museum's efforts. So they started thinking about the concept of a ceramic research center, and sort of the tipping point, I think it was in 1998, Ann and Sam Davis from El Paso, Texas, donated a significant collection of about 300 objects of American and British ceramics. And Rudy retired prior to that time, but Marilyn Zeitlin, who was the director, and Heather Lineberry saw the Davis gift as sort of the tipping point. Like, we really do have a phenomenal collection here. It needs more attention and it needs a better facility. So the CRC did start in Matthews Center for several years. And then when the building became vacant across the street from the main art museum, Marilyn asked the museum university officials if that would be possible. So they ended up setting up the ceramic center in that location. And there was just a lot of enthusiasm about this undertaking. And that's when Sarah and David Lieberman made a 3-year commitment to hire a devoted curator for the collection. And that's when I stepped in the door. And
when you saw an ad.
So it really was a combination of, a lot of different people, collectors, gallery owners, Rudy's vision that ended up bearing fruit and making the CRC happen.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that. So,
Sure.
from your perspective, are there any exhibitions or publications that you worked on personally while you were there that you were you're the most proud of, or you were the most excited about?
Well, I have beside me, well, you can't see it, but I have about 10 books that during the time I was at the CRC, I project managed, edited, and at times contributed writing for the publications. But actually, before I arrived at the CRC, I was hired, but hadn't arrived in there yet. Heather was working on an exhibition called Shared Passion, the Sarah and David Lieberman collection of contemporary ceramics and craft. So I started working on that long distance, and that was a great introduction for me. To learn more about the collection, and also start creating a friendship and a bond with the Liebermans, who were great supporters and considered them great friends as well. So that was a great way to start. They had a phenomenal collection, basically a who's who in ceramics, and also they were avid collectors of baskets and fibers and other craft-based material. Let's see. Another publication I worked on, I felt it was important that we produce a catalog of the collection because there was no documentation on the ceramic collection. So I organized an exhibition, Innovation and Change, Ceramics from the ASU Art Museum collection.
I use that all the time. Thanks for that.
So I received a NEA grant. They had a category called American Masterpieces, and they provided funding for the exhibition to travel and also for the publication. And that show, I think we traveled 75 works. It ended up traveling 4 years around the country to 13 venues. So I would venture that over 100,000 people got to see the show, and I went to some of the venues to give talks, and that was a great way to expose the collection to a broader audience. And also, I asked about 14 different writers to write entries for the pieces, and we had phenomenal contributions. People like Glenn Adamson, Cindy Strauss, Jenny Sorkin, Edmund DeWall, and others. I look back and I wonder how I managed to pull all this stuff off while curating shows and raising funds for the CRC. So, but another project I really enjoyed working on was in 2009. At the time, the museum was planning a museum-wide exhibition program on the concept of sustainability. So for the Ceramic Research Center, I put together a project called Native Confluences. I was interested in working with Native American artists and how their concept of sustainability sort of differed from a more academic, Western, scientific approach to that theme. So it was an interesting project in that there were 3 teams of artists that came in at different stages to keep on adding to the project. So they were basically 7 to 10 day residencies while they were building their projects. So the first group was a collective called Post Commodity, made up of 4 Native artists from the Southwest. And it was interesting because they wanted me to ask the university permission to cut a 4-foot by 4-foot hole in the concrete floor to expose indigenous land. So, I tried to go through proper bureaucratic channels to make that happen and got turned down, but I'm not one to give up easily. So I wiggled my way through, and we eventually got permission to do that. So they cut the hole in the ground. They went to the Tohono Autumn reservation to record music. It was, a mixture of different technologies, sound, dance, and visual. And then after their project was complete, I invited Nora Naranjo Morse from the Santa Clara Pueblo, who I've worked with in the past, to add to that project. She used recycled materials to build these pods placed in the gallery and actually on top of the roof of the center. And after them, Bill and Athena Steen, who live in the outside of Tucson and are into sustainable building projects with making straw bale homes, mud plaster finishes. So that was really great. We had a ton of school groups come in to assist the artists. And yeah, there's other ones. One of the last shows I worked on at the Ceramic Center was a show called Muck, Accretions, Accumulations, and Aggregates, because I was fascinated sort of with the trend I was seeing with artists that were breaking away from the idea of working with a single object and using sometimes disparate groups of objects to create a whole. And the artists in that show were Susan Biner from ASU, David Hicks, Annabeth Rosen, Michael Fujita, Nathan Craven, and Matt Waddell. So it was a really strong group of artists, and we really got a fabulous response from that show. And yeah, so those are just a few. I was, over the 10 plus years, I was curating about 3 shows a year, but those were 2 projects that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to me. I mean, I'm working from a distance still, and to hear, sit here and be able to visualize some of those things in action is just really awesome. I can't wait to now go and look up some images and things from those times. So, well, thanks so much for sharing that. Do you have a favorite piece or ceramicist in the collection?
That's a tough one. I mean, the strength of the collection is the depth we have. But it was interesting when I first came down for an interview and was going through the open storage. I was just amazed. Having lived in Helena for so many years in the neighborhood of the Archie Bray Foundation, I got to meet so many artists that went through the Bray residency program and made friends with a lot of them. And, just walking through the stacks was like meeting old friends. I mean, some of these people it's, but, one artist in particular is Akio Takamori. Akio, when he first came to the Bray 70s. So I was with him, for many years. And fortunately, the Bray has a significant building of Akio's work. I mean, there's just so many phenomenal pieces that we have of Akio's. And, every time I walk past there, I think of all the experiences we had. I mean, our families grew up together in Helena. After he moved to the Seattle area, visiting him there and just staying in touch with him. And then, while I was at the CRC, curated his mid-career retrospective, working with him and his wife, Vicky, closely. And that show ended up touring to several venues as well. But yeah, it's really hard for me. I mean, I feel really fortunate that I was able to work with Karen Carnes closely and ended up going to Vermont, visiting her studio. Although it wasn't an ASU specific project, I worked with the Toshiko Takaezu Foundation, putting a book together. There was never really a significant book about her complete life. And at that time, her health was failing, and we had about 4 months to put the book together and on the press and in her hands about 3 days prior to her passing. So, that's something that you can't forget it. And, I visited Toshiko several times. She prior to the book project, was offering museums works from her personal collection. And so I went to New Jersey and visited her. And, Toshiko could have been a challenging personality. She came across rather stern at first if you didn't know her. But, as time went by, we became good friends. And she had a great sense of humor and was extremely generous, and we ended up getting about 18 pieces of hers for the collection. So, those experiences are just life affirming.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I was going to ask you, if there are any people in particular that you got to meet along the way, who were especially important to you, or but I think that you've already touched on that. We sort of have these heroes, and get really excited to be able to, not just work with the people, but begin to understand their work in a different context. It's sort of humanizing once you actually get to work closely with a
Right.
person.
Yeah,
As
no, I
someone,
also,
yeah,
I mean, those are all the well-known figures, but I also work quite a bit with younger emerging artists, and for a while I did a series of regional exhibitions. They were uh, juried shows where we put out a call to different regions, Northwest, Southwest, East, Midwest, and those shows were primarily emerging artists. And there was just really some exciting work, and some of the projects were site specific, so the artists came and spent time. And I've always been a supporter of both emerging and established artists over. So that project was gratifying as well.
yeah, absolutely. So I'm thinking too, I guess I'd like to turn the conversation just a little bit towards the impact of the CRC, not just on ASU, whether it's, faculty or students or more broadly speaking, but I mean, the CRC has, such an incredible archive and ceramics library. So not just the actual, collection of ceramic objects, but, also the library and all of the archival resources that are there. What do you see as, a couple of the most unique strengths as far as resources or teaching tools and opportunities, or even events that are sort of community building? What do you see as the most sort of unique offerings of the CRC?
Well, I think first and foremost is the depth of the collection, and then within that scope, depth of certain artists. Uh, there were when I first arrived, there were very few holes to fill because Rudy Turk did such a phenomenal job, and he was collecting ceramics when no other museums were really that involved with it, other than maybe the Everson in Syracuse and a few others. So he was pretty prescient as far as his vision. Uh, and then, over the years, we were fortunate, with Susan Peterson's archives. I mean, several thousand artist files, support material for her books on Soji Hamada, Maria Martinez, June Kaneko, and then later on, getting the Studio Potter magazine archives that Jerry Williams amassed over the years. And the wonderful thing about the Studio Potter archives is for years Jerry traveled around the country interviewing artists, and we have all those recorded interviews, and I think some of them digitized and transcribed. Yeah, I think, uh, there's a lot of potential. There's just so many stories behind the pieces and the artists, their experiences, especially the older generation that was sort of the first wave of post World War II studio ceramics. I mean, a lot of them really struggled to get to where they were, and those stories can be revealed through their oral histories and tapes. And at one time, I was trying to figure a way to get their voices part of the open storage, where you could put on headphones and really listen to the artist talk. And there's ways that could be more interactive. But with that said, the collection has always been a great resource to ASU students. And foremost, they came for all the shows. We always had a student intern every semester. I created a lecture series, the Jan Fisher Memorial Lecture Series, that did emerging and established women artists through the generosity of the Fisher family. And the requirements of the speakers were to come in and spend a day or two with the students, critiquing their work or talking more informally in their studios before they gave a public lecture. And we had amazing people come in for that. The first one was Patty Warashina. We had Betty Woodman, Kathy Butterly, Rose Simpson, Beth Kavner, Julie Half-Candle, Julia Galloway, on and on and on and on. So that was really a great resource for students, public as well. The other, as far as community outreach, I think it was established a little bit before I got there, but the Artist Advisory Committee, made up of community ceramic artists, got involved to support the center on a local level and helped organize the open studio tour that's still going on to this day. So that's, been close to 20 years, I guess it's been going. And it's great exposure, for the local artists, as well as highlighting support for the CRC. And then in a broader sense, the Ceramic Center was always reliant on private funds because the university didn't provide programming money. And I think it was 1 or 2 years prior to my arrival, they created these galas to raise funds. And they kept on growing over the years. And at that point, we raised about $150,000. We had almost 400 people attend, collectors from around the country. Museum groups would come for tours of collectors' homes, buy the work at the auction. So that was one way we engaged on a national level. I traveled quite a bit when I was at the Ceramic Center, and everywhere I went, I was the ambassador for the Ceramic Research Center, so I was able to tell the story and show images through lectures and studio visits. The network really did expand exponentially when I was there, and I'm not taking sole credit. It involved a lot of people, but it was a pretty quiet collection for years with Rudy there. Not that many people outside the community knew about it. So host an NCICA conference there in 1990, and that helped significantly. And then binary were liaisons for the 2009 NCICA conference in Phoenix. So activities like that, traveling the collection through innovation and interchange were just some of the means to cast a wider net, broaden the exposure for the CRC.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like, so many of the resources that you're talking about are just so humanizing, for the objects and for the artists who are in the collection. And I think that's something so important that, really is just such a great resource and something that I always personally feel we need lots more of. So it's lovely to hear you talk about that. So Peter, we're at about 30 minutes. Is there anything, any last thoughts that you want to share that, things that come to your mind that I have not thought to ask you about?
Well, just on a personal level, it was interesting. I was in Montana for a number of years, and that was a great experience. And, helping the art museum there. But, I came down here, there are a lot more resources to draw on and build on. So for me, I mean, I feel extremely fortunate that I had that opportunity to be at the CRC. It really, I mean, for me on a personal and professional level, really expanded my horizons and broadened my network and created new friendships and support groups. I mean, there's just so many people that were involved to make it all happen. And, just getting to know people like Susan Peterson and others that were involved in the field, right after World War II. And we had, so many artists come just to visit casually if they were spending time in Arizona. One Sunday morning, I was working at the CRC and came out of my office and was fiddling around something in the gallery, and there was two people sticking their nose against the glass. And so I went to the door. They said, "Is it all right if we come look at the ceramics?" And it was former Vice President Walter Mondale and his wife Joan Mondale, who was a great supporter of the craft field. And so we spent an hour or so looking at the collection, talking about pots. I mean, just things like that you can't plan for, but and that's not the only example of something like that. It happened on a pretty regular basis. So yeah, I'm just really pleased, and I think ASU is just a phenomenal university. I mean, it's grown so much since I first got there. I believe Michael Crow became president about 2 years before I got there, and to see the growth and the changes and the reputation that ASU has been able to build over the years has been impressive to see, and just really enjoyed interacting with faculty and the students and going to student shows. And yeah, it was a great part of my life.
Well, I thank you so much. And, every time I talk to you, Peter, I feel inspired. So I appreciate that. And Mary Beth too, I mean, I'm here in North Carolina and I just can't wait to get in there and start digging around in the archives and see all these wonderful things you've been talking about. So thanks so much for sharing. And I'm going to stop our recording now.